Hello, this is Todd. I'm one of the administrators for the Antioch Writers Group. The Antioch Writers Group is a place dedicated to local authors to get together and share their works in progress in a positive environment where they can receive feedback to become better writers. In light of the current pandemic, we decided to do some digital videos to create resources for current writers and would-be writers to get started. For all writers, the first thing that we need to do is determine what genre we're going to write in. Now, if you watched our last video, we went through some of the more classic genres like literary fiction, westerns, horrors, romance, mysteries. So in this segment, we're going to go over some of the less conventional genres, as well as some of the subgenres that have cropped up over the last century or so. Our first genre today is the German term Bildungsroman, which is generally about the psychological development of a young adult in their journey towards maturity. This genre is about the psychological and moral growth of a character from youth into adulthood, also known as a coming-of-age story. The protagonist in a Bildungsroman story usually experiences some sort of emotional loss. They end up setting out on a journey. Along the way, they encounter conflict, and they grow into a mature person by the end of the story. Bildungsroman translates into a novel of education. Can also be called a novel of formation. 3 examples of Bildungsroman books are To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, and The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. Our next genre today is speculative fiction. This is considered a supergenre because other genres can fit into the category. It covers everything from science fiction to fantasy to dystopian novels. It is usually set in a world that is different from our own. It knows no boundaries, and there are no limits for what can exist in the world. There's some examples of speculative fiction. The classic 1984 by George Orwell, Douglas Adams's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and Philip K. Dick's novel The Man in the High Castle. Our next genre is science fiction. In science fiction, we have speculative elements in stories that don't exist in this world. Some science fiction is based in the hard natural sciences like chemistry, astronomy, physics. Other stories are inspired by the soft sciences, such as psychology, sociology, and anthropology. Some of the most common elements that you see in sci-fi are time travel, space exploration, and futuristic societies. Our first example of science fiction is A War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Our second one is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And our last sci-fi example is the Dune series by Frank Herbert. In a similar vein, our next genre is the fantasy genre. Fantasy stories are speculative stories that are set in a different universe. Fantasy stories are often inspired by different mythologies around the world. Many of the fantasy stories contain elements of magic in some way or another. Our 3 examples for the fantasy genre are the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien, the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling, and the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. Our next genre is kind of a subgenre of science fiction, and this genre is called dystopian. In dystopian stories, the societies are usually in a situation that is worse than our own. Some examples of dystopian stories are The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, and Animal Farm by George Orwell. Our next genre is magical realism. Magical realism depicts the world truthfully, but with a magical element to it. In magical realism, fantastical elements are not viewed as out of the ordinary. They are considered a normal part of the setting. Magical realism was born out of the realism movement, and magical realism is closely associated with Latin American authors. Some examples of magical realism are The Life of Pi by Jan Martel, The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, and 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The final genre that we're going to look at in these videos is realism. Realist literature is set in a time and a place that could actually exist. The events could really happen in our world. Realist literature will depict real people, places, and events, and will reflect the reality as much as possible. These stories will remain true to everyday life and will obey the laws of physics in our known world. Our first example of realist literature is Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Our second example is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. And our final example is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. So that wraps up the literary genres that you can choose from in writing your novels. Once again, this is Todd, one of the administrators for the Antioch Writers Group, and I'd like to thank you for watching this video. For more author-related content and other Antioch Library programs, please click the subscribe button.